parents with severely disabled children to choose to euthanize them shortly after birth. I'd like to firstly congratulate all the teams for making it to the semifinal. In this debate, the opening government team is from St. John's FM. We've already taken the floor. I would invite Prime Minister George Fitzpatrick to open his remarks.
Mr. Speaker, the problem today is not just with the unfair burden the status quo puts on parents of mentally disabled children. We feel that the problem is with the fundamental assumption that too many governments and too many people make about life itself. They believe that life is an inherent good, that it's good for life's sake. And I'm here to tell you that is wrong. We believe that when you fully analyze what a life is, that life is only good when it can provide you access to pleasure and access to wants and desires, and not when it provides you access to pain and only access to suffering. And we believe that, especially in the case of the severely mentally and physically disabled, especially from such a young age as childhood, that this is what they will have access to. What they will have access to is suffering. And we believe that in that specific circumstance, life is not always worth living. And we would support the rights of parents, to euthanize a child that is severely mentally or physically disabled. We're going to say that they can do this between 1 week after birth if they're really going to argue over the time frame. We think at that point, like, complications would have appeared from either genetically, which they would have with genetic testing, or from like complications from like the birthing problem where some mental disabilities can come up. So we're going to say in that specific circumstance, like, we would allow it. And first of all, this point of just that life is ultimately not worth living. Like, we would say that life is not a good in and of itself. We believe life is good when it provides you access to pleasure, when it provides you access to your wants and desires. Like, we believe that a being has some sentience. First of all, it has an ability to want, it has an ability to respond to stimulus, respond to the environment around them. Second of all, it has the ability to feel both pain and pleasure. It knows when it's being harmed, it knows when it's being benefited. And we believe that the nervous system provides you access to those sorts of things. And second of all, it's able to like want things and desire things. It's able to react to the environment by saying, I think this certain thing will benefit me, I think this certain thing is something I desire. We believe that this is something inherent to like being part of life itself. But we believe that when you start off life with such a severe mental and physical disability, what you're going to access from the very beginning is pain. And what you're access from the very beginning is suffering. And we say that in that specific circumstance, your life will be predicated on suffering just by the very nature of being alive from that point forward. So we would say in that specific circumstance, like, we would say that euthanasia is a reasonable standard. And we would say that we recognize that death isn't always a harmful thing, even in society. Like, we recognize that someone who is suffering from old age passes away. We don't say they died. We say that they were at peace, because we recognize even the benefit of like dying at that point. Like, we would say that they are at peace, that they have relaxed, that they have come forward. So we would say that in that specific circumstance, like, we recognize that like death can provide some benefits. Like, we believe that if life will be mostly a negative for you, where suffering will be accessed, then it's not worth living at all. Like, we believe that death is not something harmful, it's something neutral. And it's something neutral, which means that being dead is a benefit over being alive and suffering. So we would say that when you truly analyze what life is about, this principle that life is good for life's sake is just flat out wrong. It's a poor assumption. Yes, Ryan?
But the reality is, like, children with Down syndrome do not only experience pain, they're able to laugh, they're able to show signs of joy later on in life, and you can't deny that fact.
Well, first of all, we're not necessarily talking about children with Down syndrome in the first place. But we would say, like, second of all, like, with this idea of like the importance of parenting, but we would say like some children with Down syndrome would be able to access to it because of the importance of like parenting places on them. Because their parents have the time commitment and the want, and the desire to raise this child. And we believe that in no specific circumstance, yes, they have an opportunity to equality of life. But we recognize that those circumstances don't exist in all cases. Like, you don't choose to have a child with a disability. Like, this is something that happens. This is something that either happens from genetic conditions or something from like a complication from birth. This is not something that you choose a burden that you choose to take on. In that specific circumstance, like, we recognize that like parents are unable to take these burdens in certain circumstances. Like, there's this huge time commitment to raise a child with a cognitive disability or a physical disability. A time commitment that they can't always have access to and maintain a reasonable quality of life on their own. Like, they're forced between like two choices. Like, will they have enough money to like even maintain like raising this child by having enough time to go to work, or will they have enough time to actually like give the child the needs they're going to? Like, the importance of this in this specific circumstance cannot be overstated. Parenting sets the stage for the rest of the life of these children from such a young age. And we would say that without this willingness and without the ability of the parents to do this, that we're setting the child up for further suffering. Like we would say, in some circumstances that can be overcome, but only in circumstances where the parent would be willing and able to do it. And we would say that the foster care system would not be enough of not enough of something in this circumstance. Because not only does the foster care system generally fail when it comes to most people who are orphaned, it fails especially in the case of people who have special needs, because they just fundamentally lack the resources in order to have these children's needs facilitated. Like even more so than like parents do in a lot of these circumstances. So we would say that because there isn't another reasonable option in this circumstance, like we can't hold foster care as a reasonable option, the burden is on the parents, and in that case is specifically, like we would say the willingness of the parent and the capability of the parent has to be there to do it. And third of all, like we would say that there are certain circumstances where life can be taken, and we're going to go into that right, and I'm going to go into that right now. Like we would say, we would support the right of someone who is terminally ill to take their life with euthanasia. We feel that this is a reasonable standard by like something like the state of Oregon. We believe that when you're terminally ill and you have suffered from an incurable condition, all you have access to from that point forward for the most part is suffering. And we believe under that circumstance, you can make a rational choice to say, I would rather not live than go through this. And it was a choice that we would support. And another circumstance, like in this sort of circumstance, like we also would support like abortion in the case of like when like a cognitive ability, when a disability would show up like genetically, because we recognize that it would hold those parents at that same standard. Like we recognize that like willingness would go forward, and we recognize that this is a right that many governments support, and even the ones that don't, we believe should. We fully support that principle going forward. And we believe that that same principle can be accessed here. Because first of all, abortion doesn't cover all circumstances where someone might have a cognitive disability. Cognitive disabilities can show up from the complications of birth, either from medical error or just from something simple like the umbilical cord tying up and lacking access to oxygen, causing brain damage as birth is going on. But we would say in those circumstances, you can have a cognitive disability, and it's not something that can be covered by the standard of abortion that we have now. And we believe that there is very little difference with someone who is a week out of the womb and someone who has a fetus. It's the difference, like, it's the only difference I would really see is an umbilical cord is attached. But we see the same level of dependence, like whether you're in the mother's womb or you just came out of it. And we would say that in that specific circumstance, if we would defend the right to abortion in this circumstance, if we would defend the right to euthanasia of someone that would mostly be suffering, then the only reasonable course of option is to allow parents to euthanize their children who have this we would say that you might enjoy living your life, but if your life is predicated on suffering, it's not worth living. It's not a good in and of itself. And we believe that the importance of parenting cannot be overstated, and we need to give the parents the right and the capability to raise their children or take their children's life if there will only be suffering to occur, which is why we're proud to propose.
For his comments, we'll move over to the opening opposition team, which is from Cornell, BOYE, and to open up the case for them, we have Alice.
We like to pronounce it Booyah. So for years, Ryan has been telling me that if he were my father, he would have killed me the second he saw me. So to defend my life, I'm very, very proud to oppose, right? What we're going to talk to today is why the state has a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable in society, right? And we think there couldn't be anything more vulnerable than a disabled newborn. Second of all, we're going to talk to you about why life is important and why we don't think that anyone has the right to take away your life, specifically in this case, unless there's an extreme violation of rights, which we'll talk about later. And third, we want to talk about parental rights, what their limit is, how far they go, and why we don't think they apply in this case. But first, some specific rebuttal. We're told that the parents will have to make this option within a week of giving birth to their child. We think that in this state, any parent, right, is in such an extreme emotional state that they're not in this state to make a rational choice as to whether or not to kill their child, right? That this choice, which will have an impact for the rest of, I guess, their lives, but also they're ending their child's lives, that this is not something that should be made that quickly after birth, right? But let's go down to the substantive arguments that are made. We're told that access to pleasure is most important, that life shouldn't just be access to pleasure, right? Or that life is about access to pleasure. Wow. That life is about access to pleasure, that's not a good in and of itself. 4 responses. First of all, right, that just because you're not happy today doesn't mean you don't have the potential to be happy in the future, right? That just because I have no pleasure today doesn't mean I should kill myself today, because in the future I still have the potential to be happy. George admits this when he says that some people with Down syndrome, in the right circumstances, can grow up and be perfectly happy, right? That's the point that said that we have potential to be happy in the long run. Second of all, whether or not that individual can be happy, we don't think is a choice that can be made by other people, right? He's saying that not that the individual says, I don't have access to pleasure, I'm going to kill myself, but other people judge whether that individual has access to pleasure and then choose to kill them. That we think violates their rights. Fourth of all, we want to say that we don't believe, right, that pain is the worst thing, and that if you're just in a state where you're like less than happy, it's worth it to die, right? We think that there is inherent good in feeling overall, and that death represents the exact emptiness of that, right? That there are people that want to experience a little bit of pain just to have feeling, and that simply emptiness is much worse. But fourth, right, and we think the worst mistake that he makes in putting forward this argument is that it rests on the assumption that disabled people can't experience pleasure, right? It rests on the assumption that those that have severe physical and emotional disabilities can't have any pleasure in life. And we'd say that even if you are severely disabled, you can get joy through other things, even if it's things as simple as family relations, right? We think that there's clear joy that can be had there. We're told that when people die, you say they're at peace, right? But we'd say that this is something that's just said to make the rest of us feel better. It's not actual belief that death is Then we're told that the fostering system isn't good enough. This to me sounds like a great argument for improving the foster system, not for allowing parents to kill their kids, right? We'd say that's a more extreme option given out here. Then we're given two examples where you can violate life, right? Euthanasia. We'd say, first of all, this is begging the question of the topic, but second of all, in that case, it's an individual choice, which is the difference here, that other people choose for the kid. Then we're given the example of abortion. And abortion is very different for two reasons. First of all, we only allow abortion when it's so early that the kid could not live outside the womb, where in this case, the person you're killing could live and would live if you didn't kill him. But second of all, we'd say that abortion represents an extreme violation of the woman's bodily integrity, right? Which is no longer true the second you give birth. That the reason we allow the woman to choose is because her rights to bodily integrity are violated, which aren't violated here. Positive measure. We'd say that the state has a responsibility to protect the most vulnerable in society. That the reason state exists is to balance different interests and rights. That we think everyone has interests and rights, and when those conflict, we need a body that can arbitrate between them. But so that not everyone can protect their own rights and interests to the same degree. That's why society steps in and protects those that can't protect themselves, right? So we have the American with Disabilities Act. We have acts designed to protect the elderly because they can't protect themselves. Even OBGYNs are told to watch mothers right after they give birth, to watch their actions towards the baby because babies are in incredible harm directly after, right? We're told to always look after those who are most likely to be left out because their interests can't be protected themselves. Go ahead.
If the people that the government will be protecting by keeping them alive will only continue to suffer further by keeping them alive, isn't a government fundamentally creating suffering and causing unnecessary suffering?
No. First of all, there is something inherently good in life, which I'll get to in my second argument. But second of all, if you're going to take it away, it needs to be the individual's choice. It can't be the state's choice or the parent's choice. It needs to be the person themselves that decides. Now let's talk about life, right? We'd say that life is an extremely important right, and that's why we defer all things to it, because all other rights come from life. But second of all, that this choice to take away the baby's right to life is severe and irreversible, right? What the state needs to step in and protect and not allow parents to do this is the future interests of the child going forward, right? To say that even if, as a kid, you're suffering, that you might find meaning going forward, and that you have the right to discover that and go on your own life path and see if you can make something of your life. That we're not going to cut it off before it even gets started, right? And that's why we say that society always assumes life. That if you're in a car accident and you're turned into a vegetable, and you haven't told anyone whether you'd like to be put on life support or not, the default position is we put you on life support, and we keep you alive as long as possible. Because the default is always protecting life, right? That the individual's right to life comes first, because without it, they can't have any others. But third, I want to talk about parental rights. We'd say that parents have rights over their children, more rights than in any other situation, because they're assumed to have the best interests of the child in mind, right? That's what was talked about by the Supreme Court in Trotter v. Granville. But we'd say that we put limits on it when we say that the parents are clearly not acting in the best interest of the child, or when it comes to life, right? So when we see examples of neglect, you step in, because we see the parents are no longer acting in the best interest of the child. In this case, we also see that we don't allow parents to kill the child, that we assume that's always left to the child's choice. So we don't allow Jehovah's Witnesses to deny life-saving cancer treatment to their children, even though it's based on their religion. Because we'd say, you're not acting in the best interest of the child by letting them die, that's something that's going against. We'd say similarly, in this case, when the parent, within a week of the child's birth, says it's better for that child to die, that we don't assume the child has that the parents have the best interest of the child in mind, that stepping in and violating life is not a right we give to the parent just because they are the parent or just because they'll have financial obligations. So what have we presented to you today? We've told you that the state needs to protect the most vulnerable in society and give them the most protection of rights, not that those that they can be trampled on the most easily. Second of all, that life is an extremely important right that can only be overturned by the individual's choice themselves, because from it stems every other right. And third of all, that parental rights do not extend to choosing life or death for their child. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for his comments. We will move back over to the opening government bench on the deputy prime minister on stage with him.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think a lot of what we heard from opening opposition talked about why life is so incredibly important, but we didn't hear any reasons why. That's what my side presented to you, is a reason as to why we think life is so important, why the right to life exists. That right to life exists the moment we have either a good quality of life or the potential for a good quality of life to occur. We'd say that at the stage when a child is born with severe mental or physical disabilities, we'd say at that stage, when the parent is incapable or unwilling to take care of that child, we'd say at that stage, the potential to have a good quality of life is diminished to the point where the right to life simply is not worth protecting anymore. It's time to end that suffering, it's time to end that pain, and we'd say that it's okay if you want to euthanize that child. That's what we brought you on side government. So let me get into a couple of points of refutation. Because I feel like the idea about state responsibility and parental rights, these are all based on the idea of life being important within itself. But we don't see that as that's the case. We say that life is important as long as there's potential or a quality of life already existing. That's where parental rights kick in terms of neglect and child abuse. We support those things, right? Because we'd say that when you're neglecting your child or when you're abusing your child, we'd say that at that stage, that it's okay to step in. At that stage, it's okay because you're harming that child's quality of life, and that child still has the potential to have a good quality of life if either you stop doing that or if that child was taken away from you, right? So we'd say at that stage that it's protect those standards of neglect, and we protect those standards against child abuse. Go ahead.
If it's possible to objectively determine whether they have the potential for life, would you allow other actors besides the parent to make this choice?
No, because ultimately it's up to the parents to decide whether they are capable and willing to take care of these children. When it's a 1-week-old baby, right? We'd say it's up to the parents to decide whether they are able to commit the money, the time, and the emotional turmoil, that emotional capital that they're going to have to provide for that child. We'd say at that stage, when it's a 1-week-old baby, it is up to the parents to decide, because the parents are going to be setting up the type of living conditions for that child. Okay, so moving on. Let's talk about this idea about when the state has to step in, right? Again, as I talked about, this is about life being important within itself, but we don't think that's the case, right? The only thing we heard about why life is important, we just said life is important and it has to be an individual choice. Well, the 1-week-old baby is simply incapable of making that choice, right? We say the 1-week-old baby is simply incapable of making that choice, and at that stage, it comes down to the caretakers, to the stewards of that child, to be making that choice for the child. And or unwilling to provide for that child, then at that stage they have to make that choice, right? They have to make that call. So what have we talked about on side government, and what am I going to provide for you today? I want to rebuild some of what was talked about, right? So let's get into this idea. First of all, just a quick throwaway point on the emotional state, right? Parents are simply incapable of making this choice. We'd say no, right? We'd say it is an emotional time, but you have first of all, when you're making a call like this, you're able to most rational actors are able to separate their emotions from their logic. They're able to make these kinds of important calls. And secondly, we'd say that you can still make a rational call because you have doctors present, right? You have other people there who are able to advise you as to like care of this child and what kind of conditions is this child going to be living in, right? And then secondly, we get into this idea about like why the potential for life is important. And one of the main problems I have with their refutation was this idea about like pain is important within itself, feeling is important within itself. Like why, right? Why is pain important? Why is feeling important? At the stage when you're condemning this child to a life of pain, why is that a good life? Why is that a life worth living? Why wouldn't we end that life, right? Secondly, we get into this idea about the potential for life is still going to exist. That's exactly what I'm going to talk about, because I'm going to prove to you why that potential for life simply is not going to exist for this 1-week-old child if the parent is incapable or unwilling, right? And finally, this idea about we'd say that this is a good standard to uphold, right? At the stage when you're unable, or at the stage when the potential for a good quality of life does not exist anymore, we'd say that at that stage you can end that life. So when do we protect life, right? I'd say we protect, this is when we protect life. And this is why we support things like child abuse, right? When the potential for a quality of life exists. So for these children, right, why doesn't this potential for life exist? Well, first of all, because of the nature of their disabilities, right? When there's a severe physical or mental disability, the parent is put under an immense burden to provide for that child. And at many times in the cases of these disabilities, whatever they do, they're not going to help. In cases of things like sclerosis, which at times can kick into the, even when you're simply still an infant, and your central nervous system starts to completely decay, like what kind of quality of life are we providing for this 3-year-old child? What kind of potential for a good quality of life is left at the stage when at 3 years old, their central nervous system is going to start completely decaying? None, Mr. Speaker. None. So at that stage, right, we'd say that the nature of their physical and mental disability would say that their quality of life is already severely diminished. But it gets even worse when we get into the idea about like parental care and parental responsibilities, right? Because we'd say that we'd still allow these parents to make this call, because if they feel that they can care for a child who has a severe mental or physical disability, we'd say if they feel that they can provide the money, the time, and go through the emotional turmoil that they're going to have to go through to still provide for that child, we'd say that fine, let them do it. But if they are incapable or unwilling, right? If they are incapable to provide monetarily or time-wise to take care of this child, what kind of quality of life is this child going to have? Right? Ultimately, we'd say that first of all, the child is going to endure incredible physical pain if that's the kind of physical disability they have. But secondly, there's going to be an incredible amount of emotional pain because this is an unwanted child, or this is a child that simply cannot, or this is an unwanted child, or a child, and that kind of pain that you get from that kind of message your parents give you. That's an emotional harm that we think that ultimately results in a very poor quality of life. So what are the alternatives? Because I think that one of the main alternatives that we could have is like foster care. And foster care works, foster care we already see fails under the status quo, in that like the foster homes are incredibly overburdened, right? But it's even worse in situations when the child is physically or mentally disabled, because the amount of resources that it takes monetarily to provide for these children is incredibly high. And the fact is they're going to be remaining within the foster care system for an incredibly long time. At that stage, right, when the foster care system is unable to provide, and even if they try to, they're still going to be condemning this child to a life of incredible pain, both mentally, physically, and emotionally. Why are we protecting this child's right to life? Right? What are we protecting in that case? A life of pain is not a life worth living. Thank you.
Thank the Speaker for his comments, and moving back over to the opening opposition, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, which is Brian.
I don't actually have a joke to open up my speech, because I think Alice and I have really hurt our partnership by actively mischaracterizing each other. But Mr. Speaker, what I'm going to tell you today is 2 points. First, I'm going to tell you that we don't think that the government should ever advocate a policy that says that suffering is a justification for death. I'm going to prove to you how people can actually self-actualize within the context of suffering, and how people with these diseases can actually have a meaning that they aspire to in life. And secondly, why we think that this policy is particularly discriminatory to those who are poor, who perhaps deserve actually more protection, that actually more vulnerable have access to poor quality of services. But before we do that, let's take a look at the first government's case. So first of all, this idea that they said, well, we haven't proved why life is inherently good. But we think that George kind of like admitted this when he said, no, we think that children all have the potential, like even children with Down syndrome or with other severe disabilities, all have the potential to feel joy, or potential to be at a point where you would consider them to be a good contributing member of society. We think it just really depends on people's responses to them, right? At which point we say that's exactly our point. The moment that you tell people that children with Down syndrome can never attain like pleasure, that people with Child syndrome do not have a purpose in society, we ask two major questions. First of all, how does that change the way that society treats children with Down syndrome that parents do decide to keep, right? How does that change parents' responses to say, I want my child to live and to be able to self-actualize, and for everyone else in society to say, nah, your child has no potential, why did you keep him alive? We think that's tremendous potential, tremendous pressure, first of all, on these parents. But more importantly, we think that harms the ability of that child to attain this potential that George talked about. Right? Secondly, they said, well, the parent won't take care of the child. We think that this is the problem. Why is it then that we have a foster care system? But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, besides the fact that they just kind of argued that like all children who goes to orphanages should actually be killed because they can never self-actualize. But more importantly, we asked the question, that's a bigger question, is that if a parent decides to have the child, not to kill it, and put that child for adoption, what does the orphanage do with it? I want an answer from the next speaker that tells us, like, insofar as they said, well, you know, like, the child has no purpose, he can't really self-actualize. Our question is, does that mean that the state can then go actively and kill that child? Is that the state, who's the caretaker of that child, have that right? They haven't actually proven to that case. Lastly, they haven't proven to us that the parent is the best decision-making body. At which point Alex then say that there is no right decision-making body in this particular case, right? For a few reasons. First of all, we always try to maintain the status quo when it comes to life. Alex gave you the example that if you suddenly became a vegetable from a car accident and you left no will, we keep you alive, right? We don't assume that you want to die. Because the moment that you decide to die, or the moment that we take you off life support, you can't access any of your rights again. You can't decide to come back to life. You can't decide to come back to access pleasures, right? At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, just to broadcast for you what Alex and I are saying, is that we think that broadly in life, we have two interests. We have an interest to enjoy pleasures, and we have an interest to avoid pain. We think this side of the house says, if you have pain, then you don't have a purpose in life. But Alex and I believe that these people can access their interest to pleasure, as George had admitted in his speech, that these people can have the potential to access those pleasures in a certain way. And secondly, we think that insofar as that's true, the decision of whether to be alive in this particular case rests with the individual. It is not up to the parents, it is not up to the state. In fact, it is up to absolutely no one in the case of a child who cannot speak for himself to decide whether or not he should be alive. Because he has those interests, and you simply don't know, right? Like, unless the person is going to tell. My first point today is the fact that we don't think that this particular government policy sends a very dangerous statement about the fact that suffering is a justification for death. For a few reasons. First of all, Alice and I say that people can actually self-actualize while being disabled. Right? We see lots of cases of this. We see children with Down syndrome that actually have tremendous musical abilities. We see children with autism, even children with very severe disabilities, where the doctors say, you will never be able to talk, this child will never be able to communicate with you, this child will never be able to walk, ended up demonstrating miraculous feats. In this particular case, it is absolutely wrong for any parent to decide and deprive that child of the opportunity to access all of those things and become a contributing member of society and enjoy those pleasures. Right? Secondly, we say that like there is a lot of medical advances, right? Like this side of the house completely negates the fact that medical advances in the region of like medical and physical disabilities occur all the time, which will improve these people's ability to access pleasure. But my last subpoint on this issue is that we think that what truly makes us human is our ability, in addition to accessing pleasures, but to also find meaning within suffering. We believe that people can actually find meaning within suffering. Right? We see people who've just gotten cancer diagnosis or undergoing Alzheimer's, still being very strong, still like actually communicating their experiences to others in community, finding a role for themselves within that community. Or even if you don't buy that, these people will be able to get to a level where they're able to do that. Alex and I think there's probably a value in like the joys and the momentary joys that you experience like on any day, right? Like a friend of mine has a brother with like very severe Down syndrome, cannot talk, but she tells me that she's able to see that he like enjoys certain things, that he is able to recognize her when she sees like members of the family, right? We think those are very important ideas. Go ahead, George.
Our case deals with what's likely to happen in the scenario where these people have a severe disability and
Likely.
the parents are
The keyword is
unwilling to go
likely.
forth.
It is not
Shouldn't the policy deal with what's
Okay,
likely and not theoretical?
Sit down. It's the same question. You're talking about likely, right? We don't think it is your right to decide whether a person is likely or unlikely to be able to access all of these rights and become a contributing member of society. Because when it comes to people's right to life, Mr. Speaker, we don't roll a die and decide whether you do or do not exercise life or not. But secondly, when we're talking about how this will particularly affect certain people in society, we think that this is particularly bad for the poor, right? Because first of all, they have poor doctors, right? Like they have less capable medical people who can give them the diagnosis. Secondly, they don't have enough access to medical knowledge to be able to know how the child will be able to live. But thirdly, as Alex and I said, that we think that these people actually deserve more protection. Like in the same case, okay, even if the parents don't have resources to take care of the child, then a lot of times the state takes care of it. Actually all the time the state takes care of the child. Right? If you have a child and you're unable to take care of it, we decide it's the role of the state to protect the future interests of that child and to take care of that child. These are the people, Mr. Speaker, that deserve particular protection, and we think they should be heard under this model, when they essentially said that people with disabilities don't have the same right to life as those that are not disabled. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, we understand that the ability to live and the ability to find meaning within one's life is particularly complicated. We don't think it's a simple matter of, if you suffer too much, you should not be alive. We think that because those interests are complicated, and because this child cannot communicate it to us, it is not the right for anyone in society to roll a dice and decide whether or not they should live. And for all those reasons, we're proud to oppose.
Moving on to the second half of the debate, we have the closing government team also focused on the extended speaker from the MSA.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're asked in this debate to do a balancing of rights. On this side of the House, you have the rights of the parents. On this side of the House, you have the rights of that child. Today, I'm going to go through those two things for you in my speech today. The first thing I'm going to say is the parents are the delegates of, or in this scenario, the parents have that right over the life of that child. That responds directly to the challenge on side opposition that says, well, why not, some random man on the street? Why can't that person have the right? We're going to say the parents uniquely have the right over children on every, on most of the things that I can. The second thing is I'm going to talk about how humanness is not something biological. We're not human because we were born to human parents. We're human because of certain innate qualities that make us human, and I'm going to show you why that is the case. The final thing I'm going to show you is how laws should in fact reflect social values, but it should also reflect changes in technology and how they should respond to those things. Before we go on to that, let's do some cases of rebuttal. Because they seem to say on their side of the House, right, the state cannot, say that suffering, for example, is just nominally bad. We're not saying that on our side of the House. We are saying that suffering is very, very probable in the cases of severely handicapped children. We are in no way saying that always the case. We say, therefore, that when you have this choice to make, that choice should be left up to the parents, not to the state. We are in no way supporting anyone else apart from the parents having this decision. The state is only giving the choice to the parents, and therefore it isn't any kind of state-imposed standard. The second argument he made, or the second point of contention, no thank you, was the effects of the poor. Well, we'd say that actually, given what first proposition said, given your ability to provide for the child, for example, compounds your ability to make sure that it suffers as little as possible, we do think actually this benefits the poor because they don't have to be as negatively affected as they would. Because the only example they gave us was, well, euthanasia isn't the same thing because individuals have that choice. Well, what we'd argue is in the cases of euthanasia, for example, there are people who are so severely vegetative that they cannot make that decision for themselves. We'd argue this is a similar scenario in which severely handicapped children simply cannot make that decision for themselves, and we argue their parents should be able to make that decision in their place. The second argument they made against the idea that it was comparable to abortion was simply that, well, it's before and after, the baby comes out of the mother's womb. We say that's in fact very, very arbitrary. A mother that decides to abort a child that has a potential to live a very fulfilling life is still making that decision on behalf of something that has a potential for life. We argue that they haven't really dealt with this comparison at all. Simply by saying it's before and after birth, therefore they're different, no thank you, is not a sufficient response to the comparison we've made. In fact, the rights of the parents do exist under the status quo. Parents can deny no thank you vaccinations that can save the life of their children. They can decide not to teach their kids to put on seatbelts when they drive. They can make all kinds of decisions, no thank you, that can kill their children. No, they gave the example of what? Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, only in the States is that not allowed. In most other Western liberal democracies, it is allowed for parents to make decisions based on their religious beliefs. Parents can make decisions about whether or not you should, homeschool your kid, which school you should send your kid to, what to feed your children that affects on the nutrition of that child, no thank you, when they grow up and what they do when they grow up. We argue that these, in fact, decisions that also determine the life and death of a child are delegated to the parents. Why? Because we think the state gives this right to parents because they think they have the child's best interests in mind. So a parent might, for example, think that suffering is not going to happen, or that they can do all they can to minimize those sufferings, and would therefore choose to make their child live because they think that is possible, because they think that's the best interest of their child. No, thank you. So therefore we'd argue this should be a responsibility that's delegated to these parents. Parents can make their kids, play American football that can result in severe concussion and turn their children into put them into vegetative states. No, thank you. We argue that this is sort of a similar scenario, right? There's no real, or there's, it's an arbitrary distinction to say that, a severely handicapped child in the beginning of their lives and later on in their lives is an arbitrary distinction to make. The second thing, no, thank you, is as a parent, the reason why you get that extra choice is because you have to provide for that child, and if your ability to provide for that child is not, you cannot actualize that. We think that should be allowed to you should be allowed to put that into your decision. Yes, sir.
Well, if you can't take care of the child, normally in cases, parents give up the child for adoption. Right? We don't allow the parents to can't
we make the same argument for abortion, right? But that's the exact same thing that happens in the case of abortion. You could decide to have your child live and send them to a foster home, but we argue that parents make that choice because they think it's the right thing to do, or it's the right decision to make in the best interest of that child. But the second argument that Irene and I are going to make is sort of a slightly more subversive one, right? That what makes us human, no thank you, what makes us all humans here today isn't because we were born to human parents and human dads and moms. We think your ability to get rights as a human being depends on your ability to, number one, actualize those rights, but secondly, reciprocate and respect those rights in a social contract, in a society. We think that, for example, babies don't get the right to vote. Why? Because they cannot vote, right? Because they simply don't have the capacity to decide on political decisions. We say that what makes us humans, what gives us certain rights, like the right to live, as they throw out as this, huge, enormous, amazing concept, and therefore as a trumping argument, simply doesn't work. Who are these people? And we think the quality of that life also determines whether or not they get those rights to life as they would have. So therefore, when we consider a balance of rights in this scenario, what we have are parents' rights on one side of the house, and yet also severely handicapped children on the other side. We don't think their, absolute right to life exists in their scenario because they don't have the ability to actualize and reciprocate rights in the same way that everyone else is able to. No, thank you. The final thing I'd like to talk about is how laws should reflect social values. Number one, we argue that, in fact, first proposition's argument has a lot of social sympathy and has a lot of social agreement with that. When Terry Schleimel, for example, the case came out and she, her husband wasn't allowed to, let her be put to death, everyone was really sympathetic about the situation. We think there is a tremendous amount of social sympathy when it comes to this issue, and we do think the laws should reflect those social values when they have come to change. But the second thing is, you should also reflect changes in sciences, right? Science has told us about, the mental capacity of these children and what they're able to do and their amount of suffering. We say this is the same thing. We now allow testimony about the psychological state of an individual, when it comes to killing someone. We think when you take into these new scientific information into hand, we do change laws based on them because it's important when it comes to formulating those laws. So what have I told you today? Number one, I've told you we give this rights to parents when it comes to determine what is the best interest they have in mind for their children. The second thing I told you was that humanness is not biological. Just because severely handicapped children are born to human parents doesn't mean it entitles them to the same body of rights as everyone else does because they're different, because they cannot actualize and reciprocate those rights. The final thing is, I think, was that laws reflect social values and should be subject to change when science gives us more information. For these reasons, this case must stand. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for your comments. We're going to move on to the last piece of debate, which is Grove City. Open up the case, and then we have a member of the
The last speaker closed by saying, you aren't just human because you are biological. And we entirely agree. Our whole argument of the intrinsic value of human life is it's not just this biological thing, it is the capacity to love, to feel emotion, to have those relationships that really is what clearly defines what makes you human and the intrinsic value in human life. And that is why we err on the side of protecting the rights of a child. And this has been granted by the government team that that capacity is there. And this is important to understand, that that capacity is there, and that capacity to love and have these emotions is there, and this will be important when we go through my points of extension and rebuttal. With that, I'll be bringing up a number of points of extension. There will be 4 points of extension, 3 of which introduce some new argumentations around, and then 1 point of extension that ties in with the intrinsic value of life. Then we'll be ending on some rebuttal. So into these new points of extension. First of all, let's talk about psychological persecution. Psychological persecution. There's been a lot of discussion here about, how the mechanics of this will work, but we are talking about human beings here. And when we are talking about these parents that are going to be making this decision, the children that are affected by this decision, the severely disabled children that are already living today that are affected by this, we have to think about the psychological implications to them as humans. So first of all, the first point that we really need to understand, this is the first idea of analysis, is that there are severely disabled individuals with cognitive capabilities. They do have some level of cognitive capabilities, and these cases do exist. And basically the message that we're sending to these people is that you're not fully human. That basically your parents had the choice to either kill you or not. You're not fully human in any way, shape, or form. And if you listen to the words directly coming out of the last speaker's mouth that specifically says that just because you have the capacity doesn't mean that you're human. What kind of message, psychological message, does this send to those with these cognitive capabilities? Further, it makes the disabled feel like a burden on society. The point at which you say, you're absolutely, you're not human in any way, shape, or form, this makes them feel like a burden. Finally, underneath this, it places parents in a horrible situation, which leads me to my second extension point of new analysis. And this is titled, familiar torture is the idea here. Think about the implications, not just to the individuals, the severely disabled. You have to think about the psychological implications on the family unit as a whole. First off, this places parents in eternal self-doubt for the rest of their lives. They're going to be questioning, did I make the right decision when this came to place? Basically, if you think about this, this is a moral dilemma that some psychotic killer would put a parent in, where you choose between a severely disabled child and then taking the life of the child. That's the type of scenario that some psychotic killer would put parents in. And this is exactly what we have these government teams proposing, placing parents in this position where they have to make this decision. You have to think about the psychological ramifications of this. So basically, the parents will always regret the decision they made. Further underneath this, they have not thought about any sort of idea of parental disputes. What if the parents disagree? What does this lead to in this question we have here? This is a huge issue that has not been addressed. What we see here is that there is a disagreement between the parents. You have a huge issue that will tear apart the family, and it's a matter of life and death. And what ramifications does this have on other siblings and other individuals that are affected by this? There are huge implications to this policy that have not been in any way, shape, or form analyzed by these government teams. All right. Let's talk about now the third point of new analysis, and this is the risk of premeditated murder. And I entitled this as premeditated murder because this is indeed a very serious issue when we talk about the intrinsic value of life and what can happen here. First, underneath this is a purely parental decision, which has been acknowledged by the government teams. They say, well, they can get input by doctors and different things like that, but this is, in the end, completely within the hands of these two parents deciding upon this. What we see is that what if there is the example of a parent, God forbid that this happens, but based on selfish reasoning decides that I just really don't feel like I could provide for this child, and makes that decision. This completely leaves it open to this possibility of happening. And at that point where you've set up a system that would allow for something like this, that would basically count as premeditated murder, you cannot support a system that even opens up the possible door of an event like this happening. Yes?
What is the philosophical difference between this and abortion?
As we talked about, we don't. A lot of Western democracies don't allow late-term abortions. That at the point where the child can separate from the parent and live individually, that is a huge point. All right, talking about underneath further. this idea, and we look at what is the idea that this parent does have. Well, if you look at this, we've set up all the examples of why no parent would ever should make this decision to actually take the life. That basically all this child needs is a loving parent. If you look at the evidence for these severely disabled children, all they need really is a loving parent. There's disability benefits, so if you're low income, you shouldn't be forced to make this decision. Further, we've talked about adoption and how this is an option. So what are the parents that will make this decision? It's probably those parents that aren't thinking in an altruistic way, and are actually, unfortunately, thinking in a more selfish manner, which then basically does paint this as murder, and something that you do not want to open the door for in any way, shape, or form. If in any way parents make a decision of we're just going to try to remove this nuisance, what have you supported? What have you done by supporting this motion? All right, let's end by talking about the last extension of the intrinsic value of human life. And I think there's been a lot of work done here, but basically I want to tie in what I said at the beginning of my speech, that capacity to feel, that capacity to love, and that basic idea of a relationship, as was talked about by the first talk, that it has been demonstrated that there are feelings, and that this has been established as, despite what the scientific community has said, more research has developed and shown this. So what does this mean as far as rebuttal now when we stand back? First of all, the first point of rebuttal is the failure of a utilitarian calculus. And this is a huge problem with what the government has been saying all along. First of all, it's incredibly idealistic that we can sit down, weigh objectively all these, how much pleasure is there going to be, how much pain in this life. It's completely idealistic. There's no practical implication that this will be used in any way, shape, or form. Second, this is a subjective decision by the parents that they basically admitted. Yes, they consult the doctors, but ultimately it's a subjective decision. Utilitarianism is supposed to be purely objective, but it's a subjective decision by the parents. Finally, that you cannot calculate emotions. How does emotions and how does the idea of interpersonal relationships fit into this utilitarian calculus? It can't. That's a basic underlying flaw of utilitarianism that this government policy has not been able to show. So in the end, when you look at this, you see that there's absolutely no way that you can be making this decision in a correct way, that all the correct institutions are set up for parents to provide a loving, caring home, and they will get disability benefits as well, and that is why opposition is warranted. We cannot open up this and even think of an idea that could even relate to murder. Thank you.
Thank you, Speaker, for your comments. We'll go over to the government best amount of time for you have Irene to summarize.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's always a pleasure to meet with. So let me tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to firstly refute everything's extension disclosure, and then I'll just summarize the round and tell you the three basic things. The first idea is what's best for the child, right? And secondly, we're going to talk about what's best for the parent. And lastly, we're going to talk about the right to life and what exactly does that right entail, and what does it mean, and how does it apply to society. But before all that, let's go over what he just said. We think this first idea, so the first idea is that, psychological persecution, how does it affect the other people, the other disability people who are alive? Mr. Speaker, please keep in mind in this round, we're talking about severely disabled, right? We're not talking about the mildly disabled, autistic kids, or the ones that are just who vaguely have lower mental capacity. By that sense, we just categorize retarded people. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, my point is, these people cannot appreciate life. They cannot appreciate most things in life, Mr. Speaker. Those are the people we're talking about. So when they're talking about, what's the psychological effect on these people, Mr. Speaker? We think the effect is nothing. Because the reality is that they can't appreciate it, Mr. Speaker. Therefore, we think that is false. But secondly, he talks about how this is, horrible for parents. It puts parents in a horrible situation because it's going to affect them for the rest of their lives. They're going to be bogged down by this decision. Mr. Speaker, on the POI, I'm going to ask, what is the difference between the philosophical difference between this and that of abortion, right? If I had, if while their child was in my belly, and I found out that it has autism, and I aborted it, that is the same philosophical, that's the same thing, that same kind of suffering I'm going to suffer. Maybe I'm going to think 20 years from now, what if I had that child? Maybe that child is going to turn into a great pianist, whatever, right? That is the same thing, but we allow the first form. We don't think they're fundamentally different. What he said to that, Mr. Speaker, is that, laws means late-term abortions, so we ban that in late-term abortions. That is not an answer to what we asked, or that's not a philosophical difference. Furthermore, fundamentally, we can't really draw a difference between what is at the stages of first, second, or third trimester. Or, in fact, we don't think it's that different between the first week of birth, because all of this, during all the time, there's barely any consciousness, right, Mr. Speaker? But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we think that is not always the choice, right? If you fundamentally think, I cannot live with this decision, Like I will like go crazy if I like abort the child, or if I go crazy if I kill the child. Then don't kill it. We're not saying the state has to kill a child that's as the caregiver has the right to choose, and in that sense, we think that's where this case really lies on our side of the house, right? And that's the same thing as this third point about premeditated murder. Mr. Speaker, same thing as abortion, like same logic applies, same close on the discussion. Therefore, we think that's just completely false. No. So let's go into the summary of this one. So firstly, let's look at what's best for the child, right? Like, first government got up and told you about like pain, when pain is like likely significantly greater than pleasure, Mr. Speaker, then we think that is like not good for a child to grow up in such a sense. Ryan came up here and told you that, well, they maybe can find meaning in suffering. Mr. Speaker, most of us can't even find meaning in suffering. We complain about getting a fourth in a debate round, Mr. Speaker. Like, you're never asking people like severe mental disability to find meaning. Like, I mean, Ryan, what are you smoking? But anyway, but secondly, we're talking about highly probable. And they seem to have a huge problem with it against highly probable. Think like with potential, it means everything. Well, firstly, the same can be applied to abortion. There is always potential there, right? Like, there's always potential. But we're saying when the potential is so significantly low, it becomes a probability game, right, Mr. Speaker? We're trying to make the best decision. The decision is subjective. It has to be subjective. Every decision we ever make for a child is subjective. There's no objectively best decision ever, Mr. Speaker. It is okay because of the high probability, because of the severely disabled kids that we're talking about. And then lastly, under this idea, we're talking about best for a child, like, they cannot ever make a decision. That's another huge problem they have on their side. The kids can't make the decision at the age of like 2 days, so therefore parents shouldn't make it. But let's realize for a second that most of the kids, these kids, will grow up to never be able to make this decision because they won't have the mental capacity. So we don't think this decision they will ever be able to make it. So we think it's okay to give parents the right to make it at such an early on stage in life when they don't know what is suffering and what is pain and all that stuff, Mr. Speaker. Well, let's go on to the second idea of like what's best for the parents, right? Like Emily has told you significant about like why parents have jurisdiction over the child, and she's giving you examples about vaccination and seatbelts and all these wonderful things. Now, Mr. Speaker, we think we give the parents these rights because the parents fundamentally, not always, but majority of the time, we think they have the child's best interest in mind, right, Mr. Speaker? Now, they came up here, the last speaker told you that, you know, maybe it's selfish. Maybe like it's just really bad for the parents to choose entirely from their own perspective. But we think that is okay. Because if the parent thinks that they can't take care of the child, or if they think they don't want the child, let's look at what happens to the child. If I don't want this kid, I don't want to take care of it, Mr. Speaker, and I don't have the ability to take care of it, this kid is going to grow up miserable. Like, despite like we think that kind of selfish decision, because it's such severe link to what the child will experience as it grows up, we think it's okay for parents to make that decision, even if it's selfish. Fine, Alex.
You've admitted that this is an irreversible decision made on behalf of someone else. How does your plan help the children who would have chosen to live?
We don't think we have to account for that on our side of the house necessarily, right? Like, because, like I just said, we don't know what these kids will ever have to choose. Because some of them will never even know there is such thing as a choice, or what is life, or what is there to choose from, Mr. Speaker, right? Like, so we don't think that applies. Well, furthermore, yeah, I'm sorry, the things fall through the cracks. Even the law system, like people who are innocent will like get killed or get capital punishment, whatever it is, right? Like there are innocent, there are one or two slipping through the fingers. We think that is on the grand scale of things, fine. But Mr. Speaker, they also talked about adoption, right? Like how adoption is perfectly fine. But we told you how bad the foster care system is, right? Like we don't think this is good for the child at all because the kids who are in foster care already have pretty bad lives. Why add further burden onto the foster system when it's already so bad, Mr. Speaker? And it's not like we have the funds inside to just pull out of midair to fix the foster care system to make it better, right? But lastly, let's go on to the right to life, like this analysis. And we told you on our side of the house that the right to life is not absolute. There's no such thing as absolute right, right? Like we think that we have the right to do something, like we give rights to people, and there's different things that make us human, and we have lots of different definitions. We got, they feel pleasure, or we got like they have the ability to love, or they can find a meaning to life, or whatever. We think most of these things are not like available to these kids, and we think in that sense, like they are not necessarily human, and they don't have these rights, Mr. Speaker. And they told us that this is just subjective as to whether these kids have such rights or not, and we think that fundamentally is just applied everywhere. Everything is subjective, Mr. Speaker. On On these points, we proudly propose.
Speaker for comments and conclude the debate for the opposition bench. I'm going to do this against the opposition bench, which is, please? Ding, sorry.
We do maintain as the opposition team that these children do have the right to life, and that allowing them to be euthanized because they supposedly are not going to have a good quality of life creates a dangerous precedent. It causes dangerous psychological effects on the disabled and on those who would have to make the decisions. I'm going to engage in a few points of refutation here before I move into my 3 points of extension and summarization for our side. So let's look at this refutation. First of all, the argument that the severely disabled cannot appreciate life and therefore will not experience psychological trauma because of the enaction of this law. First of all, the opposition bench has maintained throughout this round that people with Down syndrome, that people with all other sorts of disabilities can appreciate and fully engage in life, and therefore we do not see how they cannot have psychological trauma. Secondly, that many of the severely disabled, as my partner points out, do have cognitive capacities. Look to someone who's born as a quadriplegic. Yes, they're severely disabled, but their mental capacities are all there, and at that point they will know exactly what this legislation means in terms of how our society values their life. Third, it sends a message to everyone else who is slightly disabled in our society that tells them we do not think you're as valuable as everybody else because you're disabled, and had you been a little bit more disabled, we probably would have killed you. That's a terrible They said that, well, we're not saying that you have to kill these babies so that there's no real trauma for the parent. The point here is that either option is bad. Either the parent goes through life watching their child suffer and wondering if they should have killed it, or they go through life knowing that they killed that child and wondering if they should have let it live. Either way, they are tortured by their decision for the rest of their life. Third point of refutation, they say, how is this decision different from the decision to abort? Because you still have to deal with the effects of, well, maybe that child would have been a great pianist or something like this. Seeing the child holding that baby and then deciding to kill it will create unique psychological trauma, will put the parents in a uniquely binding situation that's going to cause them to have these psychological effects because holding that child creates unique emotional connections that are simply not there when it's in the womb. I'll take your point.
You conceded in your refutation that this psychological damage would be there even in the event that someone would have to raise this child on their own. So in which case, why is this damage unique enough for it to fall in opposition?
Because the psychological damage is the introduction of a new awful choice that the parents have to make. In fact, a sadistic choice, which, as my partner would say, would often be put on these people by a criminal with like a kidnapping. Give us money or we're going to kill your child. That's the kind of thing parents desperately do not want to have to deal with. So let's move on to my 3 points of extension. First, about the value of life. Second, about psychological effects. And third, about the slippery slope. We're going to talk first about life. We believe that life is inherently valuable even when people are disabled. We do not allow people to kill full-grown disabled people. We do not allow people to pull the plug on someone who's in a vegetative state because of a car accident. Why do we think that even if we don't do these things, we ought to be killing children that are born disabled? Secondly, we have demonstrated that these people can have a good quality of life, that people who have Down syndrome or other problems can still experience love and joy. And if there are situations in which they're not experiencing those things, then that's an argument for fixing the system, not for killing them. Third, even if we do think that in most of the cases these people have a poor quality of life, that's not our choice to make. It is not our choice to be able to say whether or not this child deserves the right to live. They say that that right is delegated to the parents, but there's plenty of things that are delegated to the parents, like providing for the child. But when the parent chooses not to exercise that right, not to act in the child's best interest, through doing things like neglecting the child, the state steps in and says, no, you can't do that. At the point where the parent wants to kill the child, we think the state should prevent them from doing that as well. Furthermore, as I'm going to talk about in the future, using suffering as a justification for killing people is a dangerous, dangerous precedent. But let's move on to a second conversation about the psychological effects that this will have. I'll take you.
What watching Saw 3 could give me psychological trauma. Isn't it my choice to watch it?
Yes, it's absolutely your choice to watch it, but it's not the baby's choice as to whether or not you kill them. That's the fundamental difference. Moving on to the psychological effects. First of all, on the living disabled, we send a message to them which tells them that their life is not valuable, that they live out the rest of their lives wondering if they're a burden on society and wondering if anyone cares for them, if anyone loves them. That's a terrible thing to put these people through. Secondly, we have psychological effects on those that will be born in the future and not euthanized. That they will spend, again, their entire life wondering if their parents should have killed them, if their life is valuable, and if they're a burden on their parents and on the society. That is the last thing that we want to do to a group of people that are already suffering from discrimination on so many levels. That is something we simply cannot put them through. Third, the psychological effects that this will have on parents. To ask them to choose between either killing their child or watching their child suffer, potentially for the rest of their lives, and having to live the rest of their lives knowing either that they chose one way or the other. And as I've already stated, neither of those choices is a pretty choice. Fourth, the psychological effects on families as a whole. When we have parental disagreement about whether or not this child should be killed, when we have disagreement between, say, parents and children, or grandparents and parents, about whether or not this child should be allowed to live, we could literally be tearing apart families on a grand scale, causing untold amounts of psychological damage as we cause divorce, as we cause parents to grow up without, or children to grow up without parents because their families separated over this issue. The psychological toll that this will take is something that we simply cannot allow to happen. Third, I want to talk about how this is a slippery slope. The government team has stood up here and told you that it's a good thing for selfish parents to kill their children just because they don't want them. This, once again, we do not allow selfish parents to neglect their children simply because they're an inconvenience. No, the state steps in and tells them, no, that is unacceptable. In the same way, if selfish parents want to kill their children, the state should step in there as well and say that is premeditated murder and it should not happen. Furthermore, if we're going to allow the killing of these children, why not allow the killing of all disabled people? Why not allow the killing of people in a vegetative state? Why not allow the killing of the poor or other people who are having lives that may not be what we consider to have the highest quality of life? This sets a dangerous precedent, and we do not want to allow that into our society. So for these reasons, because life is inherently valuable and we ought to preserve it, because of the gross psychological effects that this will have on numerous members of society, and because this sets a dangerous, dangerous precedent, we are proud to oppose this motion.
Thank all the speakers for all the excellent debate.